Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of Start Urban Fest, an event organized by Nesta Italia in collaboration with CRT Foundation and OGR Torino, with the support of the European Commission in the framework of the START initiative. The festival is also supported by Delta 3, Italy Torino Lingotto, and Lavazza. Today, the festival will be hosted at OGR Torino, and all but two sessions of the day will be streamed live from Sala Duomo. I am Matteo Pessione, and I am the OGR Tech Coordinator, and I am involved in innovation activities for CRT Foundation. How we can imagine the city of the future? During Start Urban Fest, we want to find multiple answers, exploring the role of the science, technology, and the art in helping us to shape a more sustainable and democratic urban future. During day one, so yesterday, we explored three key themes: green digital cities, on-life communities, and human and post-human. Hearing experiences and best practices from leading experts from all over the world. Together, we discussed issues such as ethics of AI, digital rights, co-participation process, data regulation, always considering the contribution of art, culture, and creativity in guiding us toward a more value-oriented technological development. The second day, so today, that is also the final day of the festival, we will continue this exploration, focusing on the role of cross-sectoral collaboration and on the importance of fostering alliance between companies, research centers, foundations, and public institutions to provide opportunities for experimentation. In this second day, we will also explore the main initiatives carried out in the context of START Regional Center, such as the open call City of the Future, supported by Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo, and we will announce also at the end of this day the two winners of the START Prize for Social Good, supported by CRT Foundation. But before starting with the content of today, I would like to show you a really short presentation about the OGR project, that, in my opinion, is a project really consistent with the aim of this event, so of the Start Urban Fest, considering the connection that characterize OGR in terms of mix of competence and knowledges related to innovation, new technology, but at the same time, cultural production and artistic content. But before start with this presentation, I would like to show you a really short video. So please, if we can start the video. Thank you very much. Now we could start with the presentation and with the slide, please. Okay. As you can see on this slide, the history of OGR started in 1895, so more than 100 years ago. But on 2013, Sireti Foundation decided to invest more than 100 million euro for the restoration of OGR to convert this place in a new place related to innovation and cultural production. So a sort of hub that is able to connect these different, really different knowledges. Considering the content, but also the shape from an architectural point of view of the OGR, as you can see on this picture, the OGR has two main souls. The first one is OGR Tech. This is a sort of hub related to innovation, but in particular on acceleration program for startup, scale-up, or new companies. On the other side, you can see OGR Cult. That is an hub related to cultural production in terms of contemporary art exhibition, but also live event in terms of performing art. One of the most important aims of this project, as you can understand, is to find all the connection between these two souls. Starting from OGR Tech, that, as you can see, has also a particular, really particular internal shape, we could say that our mission is to be the main national acceleration hub, not only an innovation hub, creating bridge with global tech hub. Our mission is enhancing the tech initiative at an international level in order to develop the local development through partnership with top local level players. And finally, for us, it's really important to consider also the impact of OGR Tech. So in the next 20 years, our aim is to support more than 1,000 startups, investing more than 500 million euro with all the partners, all the financial partners involved in the OGR Tech project. Considering the players or the partner of OGR Tech project, we can say that we have 5 ingredients. The first one are the corporate. We have several corporates like Leonardo, IBM, or Delta 3, that is also a sponsor of this event, that work day by day with a startup, scale-up, focusing on open innovation projects. The second ingredient and the second kind of player are the business accelerator. We work with international accelerator like Techstar, but also with local players. The third one are the investors. We work with the main financial institution in Italy to furnish to the startup and the scale-up all the financial support that they need. Applied Research Center, we work with Polytechnics of Turin, but also with the private research center like Easy Foundation. And finally, for us, it's really important to consider the network partnership. And so, for this reason, the operational partner of the OGR Tech is TAG. TAG is an European network of co-working with more than 5,000 startups and innovative people. Instead, considering the OGR Tech, as you have seen on the video, inside we have 3 different exhibition spaces related to contemporary art, but also technology and immersive spaces for kids, for example. We have also a live arena with a capacity about 3,000 people at the same time. In the past year, we done more than 100 events, cultural events, but also events related to business and to innovation. But I think that it's also important to consider all the connection that OGR has on the both sides, on a local level, but also on an international level, with the aim to create a bridge between these 2 sides. Just to give you some example, we worked in the past with subjects like Tate Modern of London, with Fondazione La Caixa, with Manchester International Festival. But at the same time, we create connection and collaboration with local, really important local institutions. For example, just to consider Castello di Rivoli, one of the most important contemporary art museums in Italy, but also with Club to Club. Also, on this perspective, we have to consider projects that involve 2 perspectives. A perspective more related to an artistic and cultural approach with a new technology and more related to corporate approach. Just to give you some example of OGR project, we work with Techstar, as I said before, but also we co-produce View Conference, that is one of the most important conferences in Europe related to new technology and animation. So, just to give you other example, all the IT technological content that create connection between our public and our artistic content are created by corporate connected with OGR Tech. So IT company that has produced experience like Tour 3D at the end of the 18th century, augmented reality experience, with the aim to furnish an educational approach related also to an artistic perspective. Other projects are Nowhere, is a really peculiar software. It's not just a video game. It's a sort of meeting between an international artist, Patrick Tutofuoco, with a local corporate mixed bag to create something that is really different from a normal video game, but it is a sort of experience, an experience as the project that I mentioned before, also with educational aim. As it is Com'era Com'è, another game or experience that we are creating for primary and secondary school, trying to propose two approaches. The first one related to a creative and a cultural perspective, but the second one is a sort of a STEM approach, an approach related to STEM disciplines. And finally, in the next 2 weeks, we will launch the first acceleration program in the South Europe with Microsoft related to gaming. Not just, obviously, entertainment gaming, but mainly consider also Start Urban Fest serious gaming. So application for the corporate that help us to support the knowledges and the involvement of their employee on their mission. And finally, to conclude this presentation, just some example of some players that work inside the OGR Tech, but that collaborate also with the OGR Cult. For example, we have Next Level, is an organization that work with school, in particular to support new artists, but as the project I mentioned before, with a STEM perspective. The second one is 3x1010. It is a corporate that works at the same time with cultural organizations, such as Egyptian Museum, but at the same time with a for-profit company, for example, Stellantis. Furnish also, in this case, this approach that try to connect two different perspectives to support, to open mind also the vision of the corporate on an artistic and cultural vision. So, thank you, and now I would like to introduce Sir Geoff Mulgan, Professor of University College at London and former CEO of Nesta. So, Geoff, welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that introduction. It is wonderful to be back in Turin, back in the amazing OGR, which I visited when it was being built, and back in 3 dimensions with at least a few of you after a long time of living in 2 dimensions. What I'm going to talk about today is really about how we come out of our crisis. If I can have my slides up, I have some visual aids to stop you having to look at me all the time. I'm going to talk about what possible good might come out of this crisis we're in. We're in a fast crisis of COVID, which still has a long way to go, and a slow crisis of climate change. And I'm interested in how we become a little bit more like these fish, able to cooperate against the big threats, the big fish which may want to eat us. We are in this very strange position where COVID was, in many ways, the world's first simultaneous crisis, experienced everywhere in real time together. It has a long way to run. Most of the world is not yet vaccinated, and we all know the harms, direct and indirect, this has done. But it's also prompted creativity, it's also prompted new kinds of imagination, and perhaps some glimpses into a better future. And that's what I want to talk about today in relation to science and art and society. And think about what the implications might be of the transformations we're already seeing around us. the incredible speed with which the world put education online within a week or 2 weeks, after years when schools and universities had struggled. 200 years after work and home were separated by the Industrial Revolution, they're sort of being reintegrated, sometimes in unhappy ways. And I'll talk about what else might be happening to welfare, science, and community. Some of the potential positives out of this crisis. Now, for us in Europe, one of the shocks of this crisis, and the same was a shock for North America, was seeing other parts of the world responding better, particularly in use of technology and data. East Asia greatly outperformed Europe and North America, and not just authoritarian countries like China, but also Taiwan, which has been one of the real success stories of much more transparent society now than Europe, using collective intelligence in its democracy in ways which feel decades ahead of what we take for granted in our parliaments and parties, let alone the US, which sometimes seems 200 years old in its democracy. Countries like Bangladesh, which you see there, developing collective intelligence systems for handling health, economy, and so on. Again, I think ahead of any country in Europe. So we need the humility to learn out of this crisis. The places which thought they were leaders in the past may not be the leaders now, and we have a lot to learn. We've also seen an extraordinary explosion of community action. Here you see a picture from one of my local food banks, a map of the community projects which sprang up to help with food, with loneliness, with all the problems of the crisis all over the world. And in the bottom right is a thing called the Good Sam app, which I'm showing because we brought some of the founders of that to Turin about 2 years ago. That platform was used to mobilize 750,000 people to volunteer to help our health service at the height of the crisis. A new model of really community action mobilized by platform technology. And there are thousands of examples all over the world of this community creativity, often filling the gaps where government couldn't respond. We've also, I think, seen, in a way, what matters in our society. This should have been clear, but maybe it needs a crisis to see this. This is a quote from the World Happiness Report 2 years ago, where they look at the countries of the world in terms of their happiness. And the front runners, countries like Finland, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, are front runners in part because of how people answer this question. If you were in trouble, do you have friends or relatives you can count on to help you? It turns out this kind of mutual human support is the foundation of happiness in our world. And that became very clear when the crisis hit and many people didn't have friends or family to count on. And I think we may have been reminded of some of the things which matter most, which are not about technology, not about the glitzy stuff, but actually are what make us thrive as human beings. I hope, at least, we remember this lesson in the next 10 years. So a lot of my work recently, the last few years, has been around collective intelligence. And I wrote a book on this 2 years ago. The fantastic Turin publisher Codice Edizioni published the Italian translation, I'm glad to say. And I've been working on trying to apply these ideas of how we turn societies into something a little bit more like a shared brain, to solve our problems, to cope with climate change, aging, inequality. And this crisis has accelerated that work massively. And I think with some quite good potentials for the future. So here's just one aspect of this, science, the world of science. That is a map of the global science collaborations done through the COVID crisis. This is not the work of one company, one university. This is networks working together in real time. Over 200,000 science papers on COVID already published. Nearly all of them open source, open access as never before, and nearly all of them collaborative. And of course, Gavi, founded 20 years ago, has pulled together COVAX. The reason the world is, to some extent, sharing its vaccines is all about new models of global science cooperation, which I hope we can then apply in the future to other fields. It's not just about what one company, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson have done. It's about global collaboration, much of it publicly funded or funded by foundations too. A few weeks ago, we had a wonderful publication from the United Nations documenting the work of 100 accelerator labs globally, which have been using collective intelligence methods partly to address the Sustainable Development Goals, things like access to water, gender equity, unemployment. They were set up about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and then pivoted in most of their countries to work on the pandemic. And this report shows how you use these new intelligence methods. Not just data and AI, though there's a lot about AI in that, but also citizen insight, people's lived experience, how you use those to understand problems better and then open up the solution seeking to anyone, anywhere, rather than just depending on the top of a government or the top academics and so on. For me, this is very inspiring, what this real-time experiment in global creativity has done. And I actually, again, think the developing world is in some ways ahead of Europe in its application of these methods. Perhaps there's been more flexibility, more openness to try things out than in the old continent we are all part of. There's also been a transformation of how we use knowledge. One of my jobs at the moment is running something called the International Public Policy Observatory on COVID, where we draw together global experience in real time on things like mental health, how to run schools, homelessness through the crisis, and then make that available for decision makers in easily digestible forms. And this is an example, again, of global collective intelligence being organized, orchestrated, curated in a very rapid way to help better action. And most recently, we've been looking at all the inequalities of COVID by race, by gender, by class, by place, and what can be done in the recovery plans to address them, drawing on evidence, drawing on global innovation as well. There's also, I think, the emergence of new kinds of global entity. I don't know how many of you know about IPBES. IPBES has been going about 10 years now. It's a follow-up to the IPCC on climate change. IPBES works on biodiversity. And again, it's a collective intelligence platform, in a sense, to bring together the world's scientific knowledge, practical knowledge, also the knowledge of indigenous peoples to help us deal with the threats to biodiversity in a more coherent way. And of course, they have been working on pandemics too. These are all a little bit below the radar, but these are the kind of positive things coming out of this crisis, which may be very significant for our future. And we were hearing yesterday on one of the sessions from the Fab Labs, one example of many of global pooled resources, shared knowledge made freely available for others. In this case, the Fab Labs, it's part of the Maker movement, but also there's examples like the one at the top there from the education newspaper, TES, which brings together learning resources. Thousands of teachers share their learning resources, and of course that has been hugely important as schools went online and teachers needed to very quickly invent a new curriculum. Again, global collective intelligence in practical, usable forms to help people cope with a crisis. Now, in a way, that's the kind of positive story about what's been happening so far. But I want to spend a few minutes before I finish on how this links to the future and to imagination. So one of the projects I've been involved in over the last year with an organization called Demos Helsinki and a network of others, about 40 organizations across Europe, in what's called the Untitled Collaborative. We've been looking at what we call the imaginary crisis. So this isn't to say that COVID is imaginary, it's not, of course, but it's to say we have a parallel crisis of imagination which we need to attend to. We can see very clearly in the activists of the school strikes and so on, a sense that the future is getting worse, that we are on a road to apocalypse. And most people, and certainly most people under 25, have a very strong picture in their heads of a heated up world food shortages, refugee crises, conflicts, of a world burning itself up because of the failure to deal with climate change. And it's right that there is that sense of urgency about action. The problem is that we don't have really almost a strong enough positive image of what could be better, the other side of dealing with those problems. To the extent that there is an imaginary, it tends to be very technology-driven, just about hardware, often with no people visible in these images of the future. Much of what's coming from AI, robotics, the fourth industrial revolution, leaves no space for humans. And I often go around asking highly educated people to describe to me, what could our welfare state look like in 2050, or healthcare, or democracy? And people struggle to answer. They can much more easily see how things could get worse. They can probably see a technology future, but not an inspiring social imaginary about how we could progress. And so I've been looking with these colleagues at some of the ways we can actually unlock shared imagination. What can we learn from the history of utopias, which goes back at least 500 years, or back to Plato, Al-Farabi, all sorts of others, and more recently to literature like Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, Kim Stanley Robinson, at least attempting to picture plausible, desirable worlds into the future, which can help us see how our actions now relate to a bigger story. Or what can we learn from the role of ideas, generative new ideas, like the circular economy, 30 or 40 years old now as an idea, adopted by the Chinese Communist Party 15 years ago, and now beginning to become part of our common sense that we always think about things like this or this in terms of how they might be reused, how we might not just bury our waste in the ground. And on the bottom right there, universal basic income is a generative idea. There's now lots of experiments around the world, and the COVID crisis has forced governments to introduce things rather like a universal basic income. It's very clear the pure model isn't very good, but variants of UBI, I think, will become much more mainstream in the next 5 or 10 years as these generative ideas evolve and change and adapt through use, through practical experiments of all kinds. I'm also interested in places which prefigure the future. There's a great history of these, and I've shown there 2 pictures from 100 years ago of the garden cities, which was one vision of a future world, actually rather similar to what many people would like to live in now, where work and home are integrated in cities with lots of greenery, lots of edible plants and so on around them. And of course, there are places like Freiburg in Germany, which are pushing quite a radical green net zero vision of how a place could be run. And interesting failures. So the bottom left is one of the pictures from Google's Sidewalk Labs attempt in Toronto to create the smart city of the future, which was rejected by the people there, in part because it had no real humanity to it, gave them no control, no sovereignty on how the place would be organized. And partly as a result of this crisis and the transformations of work and home and education, we need to rethink what villages are like, what towns are like, what cities are like, for possibly a completely different set of options than were obvious even 5 years ago. Now, I want to say a little bit before I finish about art and the role of art, because Start is about art. And here's a quote from Joseph Beuys, which probably half of you will think is very wise and half of you will think is incredibly silly. He said, "Only art is capable of dismantling the repressive effects of a senile social system that continues to totter along the death line." Now, you may or may not agree with it, but art is playing a hugely important role in testifying, in bearing witness, and in opening up new ways of seeing. The bottom right there, you see Olafur Eliasson's melting ice blocks put in city squares a few years ago to really help people visualize what climate change meant. And we've got all sorts of things coming out using VR and AR to help us understand what it feels like to be the natural world, to be a tree, to be an ecosystem. And I think we're going to see extraordinary art coming out which helps us see the world in radically new ways and feel the world in radically new ways. Last year, as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen an extraordinary sort of taking over, not just of getting rid of statues, but repurposing old monuments in new ways. This is the statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, turned into a kind of mass artwork of graffiti and feelings, an extraordinary reinvention of in a sense, a dead bit of old public culture. And there are variants of that happening all over the world, particularly in dealing with legacies of colonialism. There's an upsurge globally of art investigating data, AI, surveillance, freedom, sovereignty, etc., in ways which are often ahead of anything the academics and the researchers can do, because it's getting into that space of feeling, some of the stuff Ghislaine Boddington was talking about here yesterday. And we have much more public projects, and this is where I think it gets really exciting, which try to mobilize whole communities using art in different ways to rethink their own future, the future of their place or their town. This is one from a small town in England a couple of years ago, which involved thousands and thousands of people on social media, but also in very visible visual art, as part of a reimagination process for the town. And this is one from my hometown, which you may occasionally go through. It's airport, Luton, which used the anniversary of a riot, the centenary of a riot, when the people burnt down their town hall in an act of anger against the then elites. This was used as a spark for reimagining what kind of town did we want to be in the future, one where we wouldn't want to burn down our municipal buildings. And again, that's a sort of creative use of art to prompt a new kind of conversation, new ways of thinking, and new imagination. And there were sort of recreations of this riot done all over the town and in the town hall, involving mainly young people from all sorts of different backgrounds. This is where I think we need to go. And one of the things we're working on now is how you use creativity tools on the boundary of art and social design and politics to help us imagine how our city parks or our childcare or our pension systems could be different in the future. These are some of the almost generic tools which can be used to help with creativity, with small groups, inversion, integration, extension. So I won't explain these in detail, but inversion means you flip different roles. So in a park, you perhaps turn the park users into curators or gardeners rather than just users. Or in schools, how do you turn pupils into teachers? Integration is where, as you've done in OGR, you link many things together in a place or in a service, and so on. And these are all sparks to help us realize the world is more plastic, more shapeable than we perhaps assume. And in Europe in particular, I think we are rather stuck in our imagination. It's a long time since I heard a leading politician give a clear picture of what a better future could be 20 or 30 years ahead of us. They're very good at telling us what's wrong, and they're quite good at incremental technocratic change, but much, much worse at societal imagination. And here's just a list of some of the many methods which can be used. They range from at the top world building, which Hollywood uses to construct sci-fi worlds, through things like speculative design, speculative fiction, to the sort of role played by parliamentary committees of the future. Finland has one of those. Israel used to. Civic imagination offices, Bologna has one of those. Future generations commissioners, Wales has one of those, enshrined in legislation. Strategic foresight, Singapore does that very well under the Prime Minister. Museums of the future, Dubai is about to open an extraordinary museum of the future in a few months. Ministries of possibilities, and so on. We have some methods, but they're not being used at this boundary of art, science, imagination, and society, and yet that is what we need badly coming out of this crisis. So, my hope, and I don't know if I'm right, is that we are seeing simultaneously a leap in how we use digital technologies, not just endless Zoom meetings, but perhaps more creative uses as well. Some kinds of leap in civic action, some kinds of leap in our collective organization of knowledge, of science globally, and perhaps the beginnings of an opening up of imagination. There is very strong evidence from polling that large majorities in countries like Italy, Germany, France, UK, want this crisis to be used for transformational change, for dealing with the underlying problems of society, not just going back to where we were before. But although that aspiration is strong, I don't think it's been met by enough supply of good ideas, of creative plans of how we get to net zero, more equal societies, good aging, and so on. And I think that's, I hope, part of what projects like STARTS can contribute to. At the very macro level, it's how do we start imagining ourselves as part of a truly global consciousness, a truly global brain, perhaps linked together for the first time ever in history. And not just for the commercial extraction of your data, but actually for us together to solve our shared global problems, like climate change, like gender inequality, and so on. And perhaps if we do that, we learn to become a little bit more like these fish, that even if you are small and weak, like these fish are, you can, with the right kinds of collaboration and cooperation, save yourself from being eaten by the bigger fish. So I hope that's at least a little bit of food for thought. And now we will carry on with a very packed day. Thank you.